The wind in this part of Wyoming had no pity. It was born in the jagged teeth of the distant mountains and died 1,000 miles east. And in its long, lonesome journey, it scoured the land clean. It peeled paint from the sides of barns, worried loose shingles from rooftops, and carved the plains into a masterpiece of brutal emptiness. Fences strung with barbed wire that sang a low, mournful tune leaned away from its constant pressure, their posts bleached white as bone. In the winter, the wind carried snow that fell not down but sideways, dusting the ridges and filling the hollows until the world was a stark canvas of white and gray. In the summer, it carried dust and the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. Life here was measured in the turning of these seasons, in the slow, unyielding cycle of survival. It was a place where silence was the most common language, a deep and profound quiet broken only by the bawling of distant cattle, the cry of a hawk circling on an updraft, or the relentless whisper of that wind. It was a hard life, a lonely one, but in the fiery sunsets that bled across the vast horizon and the diamond-sharp clarity of the stars in the moonless sky, there was a beauty so stark and true it could break a man's heart. Caleb Ward was a man made of this land. He was tall and broad, with shoulders built for lifting and hands that were maps of hard labor, calloused and scarred. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke more of sorrow than of age. But it was his eyes that held the true story. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they carried a haunted gaze that rarely met another's for more than a fleeting moment. He worked his land with a grim, relentless rhythm, rising before the first hint of dawn and falling into his bed long after the sun had disappeared, his body aching with a fatigue that never quite reached the disquiet in his soul. He was alone. He had been alone for 5 years, ever since the fire, the night the barn went up in a pillar of orange flame that lit the valley like a devil's dawn. He had lost everything that mattered. He had lost his wife, Sarah, and the child she carried within her. The skeletal remains of the old barn still stood on the rise behind the house, a blackened monument to his failure. The townsfolk in Redemption Gulch had their stories. They whispered them over watered-down whiskey in the saloon and behind their hands in the general store. They said Caleb Ward had a temper like a flash flood. They said he and Sarah had been fighting that night. They said he'd been drinking. Some went so far as to say he'd set the blaze himself. Caleb heard the whispers. He saw the way they looked at him, the mix of fear and morbid curiosity, and he never once denied it. The guilt was a shroud he wore, heavier than any winter coat, and their judgment was a penance he felt he deserved. His days were a ritual of work. He mended the same fences the wind always tried to tear down. He rode the long perimeter of his property, checking on the cattle that were his only companions. He spoke to his horse, a stoic gelding named Boulder, more than he spoke to any person. The house he lived in was clean, sparse, and silent. Sarah's things were gone, packed away in a trunk in the attic, all except for one small, framed photograph on his nightstand that he could never bring himself to look at directly. The silence in the house was different from the silence of the plains. Out there, it was alive, filled with the hum of the earth. In here, it was dead, the hollow echo of a life that had been extinguished. One Tuesday, the need for salt and flour drove him into town. Redemption Gulch was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a post office. He tied Boulder to the hitching rail and kept his head down, his hat pulled low. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked the boardwalk, could hear the sudden halt in conversations as he passed. He did his business at the general store, trading curt nods with Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, and then made his way to the post office. Silas Croft, the postmaster, was a small, bird-like man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He peered at Caleb over the rims. "Ward," he said. his voice dry as dust. "Got something for you. Arrived yesterday." He disappeared into the back and returned with a single, crisp envelope. It was addressed in a clean, sharp hand that Caleb recognized immediately. His brother, Thomas, back in Philadelphia. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Caleb had fled the civilized East for the untamed West, turning his back on his family and their expectations. He had written Thomas only once, a short, terse letter informing him of Sarah's death. Thomas had never replied. Until now. Caleb took the envelope, his rough fingers feeling clumsy against the fine paper. He turned to leave, wanting to read it in the privacy of his own misery. "That ain't all," Silas said, stopping him. The postmaster held up a thicker, more official-looking document, tied with a ribbon. This came with it. Caleb took that too, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He left the post office without another word, ignoring the curious stares that followed him. He didn't open the letter until he was miles out of town, the familiar emptiness of his own land surrounding him. He stopped Boulder by a small creek, the horse dipping its head to drink as Caleb broke the seal on his brother's letter. The words were few, and each one was a sharp jab. "Caleb, I trust this finds you well, though I imagine that is asking too much. I have not forgotten the debt I owe you for handling Father's affairs after he passed. You said then you wanted nothing, but a man alone in that wilderness needs something, even if he is too stubborn to admit it. I have arranged a solution. Consider my debt paid. Her name is Elise. She is a widow, a good woman who has known hardship. She will be arriving on the next stagecoach. The enclosed contract is legal and binding. Do better by this one. Brother, treat her better than you treated the last one. Thomas." The letter trembled in Caleb's hand. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through him. A solution, a contract, a woman, a stranger, sent to him like a piece of mail-order machinery. And the final, cutting line. Treat her better than you treated the last one. The words were a brand, searing into the raw wound of his guilt. He crumpled the paper in his fist, a strangled sound escaping his throat. He looked at the other document. It was a marriage contract, already signed by an Elise Dubois and witnessed by his brother. All it needed was his signature. His first impulse was to ride back to town, to send a telegram to Thomas full of venom and refusal. He would send the woman back on the same stagecoach that brought her. He did not want another woman on his land. He did not want another life in his hands, another soul to be responsible for, another person to inevitably fail. The memory of smoke and screams, faint but eternal, rose in his mind. He was poison. Everything he touched, he destroyed. He spurred Boulder onward, riding hard, letting the wind whip at his face, trying to outrun the storm gathering inside him. But as he rode, a different feeling began to creep in. Something colder and more insidious than rage. Loneliness. It was a constant companion. An ache so familiar he often forgot it was there. But Thomas's letter had given it a name, had held it up to the light. A man alone in that wilderness needs something. He hated his brother for seeing it, for knowing it. He reached the ranch as the sun began to set. The sky painted in shades of orange and purple. He unsaddled the horse, his movements stiff and angry. He went inside the house. The silence crashed over him. He stood in the middle of the main room, looking at the empty chair by the hearth, the cold stove, the bare table. He had told himself this solitude was his choice, his penance. But was it? Or was it just a slow death? He did not send the telegram. He did not sign the contract, but he did not burn it either. He left it on the mantelpiece, a stark white rectangle in the dimming light. For 3 days, he was caught in a state of paralysis. He worked his herds, his mind a turmoil of guilt, anger, and a flicker of something he refused to acknowledge as hope. He could stop her. The stagecoach from Cheyenne only came through Redemption Gulch once a week. He knew the schedule. He could ride to the station, give the driver a message, and send her away before she ever set foot in the town. It would be the right thing to do, the kindest thing, to save her from him. But his feet felt like lead. Each morning he woke with the resolution to end it, and each evening he found himself back at his silent table, having done nothing. The loneliness, it seemed, had a stronger grip than the guilt. The day the stagecoach was due, he found himself riding toward town. He told himself it was just to watch, to see her with his own eyes before he sent her away. He told himself he owed her that much. He reached the ridge overlooking Redemption Gulch just as the coach, a lumbering beast kicking up a plume of yellow dust, rumbled into view. He watched it pull to a stop in front of the saloon. A small crowd had gathered. News traveled fast in a place where nothing ever happened. The arrival of a mail-order bride for the haunted Caleb Ward was the most exciting event of the season. He could see their faces from his vantage point, hungry with gossip. The coach door opened and a man got out. Then another, and then she appeared. The first thing he noticed was her height. She was tall for a woman, standing nearly eye to eye with the driver. She moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the dusty street. Her posture straight and proud, despite the weariness that was evident in the slight slump of her shoulders. She wore a simple, well-made traveling dress of dark gray wool, practical and unadorned. But it was the veil that captured everyone's attention, including his. It was the same shade of gray as her dress, long and thick, covering her face and head completely, shrouding her in anonymity. It was not a fashion Caleb had ever seen. It was a statement, a barrier. He saw the townsfolk lean in, whispering to one another. Old Man Henderson's wife, Martha, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a skinning knife, said something to her friend, and they both tittered behind their hands. The whispers reached him even on the ridge, carried on the wind, too proud, hiding something ugly. I'd wager. What's Ward gotten himself into now? Caleb's jaw tightened. He nudged Boulder down the slope. His decision made for him not by his own will, but by the cruel judgment in their eyes. They would not chase this woman away. He would, but he would do it on his own terms, away from their prying stares. He rode into the street, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. He stopped his horse beside the woman. He still could not see her face, only the dark outline of it through the fabric. He could feel her presence, a quiet and unnerving stillness. He dismounted, his movements economical and stiff. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Caleb Ward." He expected a reply, a question, some sign of emotion. He got nothing but a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She did not offer her name. She did not offer her hand. Her belongings, a single large trunk, were being unloaded from the coach. He paid the driver, then hefted the trunk into the back of his buckboard wagon, which he'd left tied near the general store. The weight of it surprised him. It was heavy, solid, as if it contained more than just dresses and bonnets. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly touching her elbow. The fabric of her dress was coarse, but he could feel the warmth of her arm through it. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the silent, staring town behind. The ride to the ranch was 8 miles of suffocating silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding of the horses, and the ever-present wind. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the familiar shape of his own land rising to meet them. He was acutely aware of her beside him. He could not see her eyes, but he felt them on him, studying him, measuring him. He risked a sideways glance. All he could see was the gray veil, shifting slightly in the breeze. He noticed how she sat, perfectly still, her back ramrod straight. She held a small, worn satchel in her lap, her gloved hands clasped tightly over it. She did not look at the passing scenery, did not comment on the vast, intimidating landscape. She simply endured it. A jackrabbit darted across the trail, and the led horse shied violently, pulling the wagon to a jarring halt. "Whoa now! Settle down, you fool horse!" Caleb's voice was a sharp crack in the quiet, harsher than he intended. Beside him, the woman flinched. It was a small, almost invisible movement, a tightening of her shoulders. But he saw it. It was the reaction of someone accustomed to loud, angry noises. The sight of it sent a strange, unwelcome pang of something that felt like shame through him. He gentled his voice, murmuring to the horse until it calmed. He did not look at her, but he could feel the tension radiating from her. For her part, she noticed how his gaze never once landed on her. He looked at the horses, at the trail, at the mountains, at the sky, anywhere but at the veiled figure on the seat next to him. They arrived at the ranch as twilight began to bleed the color from the sky. He pulled the wagon up before the simple wooden house. He got down and came around to her side, offering his hand to help her down. She hesitated for a moment before placing her gloved fingers in his palm. Her hand was cool and slender, but her grip was firm. He released her as soon as her feet touched the ground. "I'll get your trunk," he said, his tone flat and unwelcoming. She stood by the porch, a silent, gray sentinel. As he wrestled the heavy trunk from the wagon and carried it inside, he set it down in the main room. The house was cold. He hadn't thought to start a fire. She followed him in, her steps light on the wooden floorboards. She stopped just inside the door, her veiled head turning slowly, taking in the sparse room, the stone fireplace, the simple wooden furniture. He felt a sudden, sharp awareness of its emptiness, its lack of comfort, of life. "The kitchen is through there," he said, gesturing with his head. "You can sleep in here." He pointed to a closed door off the main room. It had been a spare room, a storage space full of things he never used. He had cleared it out that morning, a concession he'd made to the inevitable. "It's not much, but the bed is clean." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet, lower than he'd expected, and smooth, with no trace of an accent he could place. It was the first time she had spoken to him. He nodded curtly, feeling awkward and out of place in his own home. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her this was a mistake, that she should not have come, that he was not the man she thought he was. He wanted to tell her to go, but the words were stuck in his throat, choked by the ghosts that lived in the corners of that house. He watched as she moved toward the spare room. Her hand went to the edge of her veil, her fingers finding the pins that held it in place. She was going to take it off. She was going to show him her face. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He did not want to see her face. A face would make her real. A face would have eyes that could see his shame, a mouth that could speak his name. A face was a responsibility, an intimacy he could not bear. He thought of Sarah's face, bright and smiling, and then of how it must have looked in the smoke, in the fire. "Don't!" The word came out of him, a harsh, desperate sound. She froze, her hand still at her veil. He softened his voice, the harshness replaced by a raw, pleading edge that startled him. He took a half step toward her. "Don't take it off," he said, the words barely a whisper. "Please, please don't." She stood perfectly still for a long moment. He could not read her expression, could not guess at her thoughts behind that impenetrable gray curtain. He expected confusion, anger, even fear. But when she finally moved, it was only to lower her hand from the veil. She gave another one of those small, silent nods. Then she turned, opened the door to the spare room, and closed it quietly behind her, leaving him alone in the growing dark. That night, Caleb could not sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. He could hear nothing from her room, not a cough, not a footstep, not the creak of a mattress. It was as if she were not there at all, a ghost he had brought home. The silence was heavier than it had ever been before. He rose and went to the window, looking out at the moon-drenched landscape. The blackened timbers of the old barn stood silhouetted against the starry sky. A constant, jagged reminder. He felt trapped, a prisoner of his own past, on his own land. And then he heard it. From far out in the dark hills, a sound rose on the wind. It was a long, mournful cry, filled with a wild and desolate loneliness. A wolf, howling at the moon. The sound echoed across the valley, a perfect expression of the vast, unspoken distance between the man in one room and the veiled woman in the other. The days that followed settled into a pattern of cold politeness, a fragile truce governed by unspoken rules. Elise rose with the first gray light of dawn, moving through the house with a ghostly quietness. When Caleb entered the kitchen from the chill morning air, his face still numb from the wind, a pot of coffee would be steaming on the stove and a plate of biscuits, impossibly light, would be waiting on the table. He would eat, his eyes on his plate, and she would busy herself at the sink, her back to him, the gray veil a constant, unwavering curtain between them. Their words were sparse, functional things, used only when a nod or a gesture would not suffice. "More coffee?" she might ask, her voice low and even. "It might rain," he might state, his gaze on the clouds gathering over the mountains. They were like two strangers sharing a stagecoach, forced into a proximity that was both intimate and achingly distant. Caleb kept to the fields and the far pastures, losing himself in the familiar, punishing rhythm of ranch work. He mended fences, branded calves, and rode until the sun burned the back of his neck, seeking a physical exhaustion so complete it might quiet the noise in his head. Yet, he was aware of her presence in a way that unsettled him. The house was changing. The dust that had settled in the corners for years was gone. The windows were clean, letting in a brighter, sharper light. The scent of baking bread or simmering stew now met him at the door, a phantom of domesticity that felt both comforting and treacherous. He was a man accustomed to emptiness, and this slow, quiet filling of his home felt like a siege. He had 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse 100 yards from the main house. There was Jebediah, an older man with a face like a dried apple, who had worked for Caleb's father and rarely spoke more than was necessary. Then there were 2 younger men, Gus and Billy, hired on for the spring branding. They were full of the careless bravado of youth, and they watched the main house with insatiable curiosity. They watched Elise. They saw how she brought their midday meal to the bunkhouse porch, setting down the heavy pot and the stack of plates without a word, and leaving before they could offer thanks. They noted with crude jokes and speculation that she never removed the veil, not even when the sun beat down with a merciless intensity, shimmering off the dry earth. They whispered that she never smiled, that her voice was as soft and rare as a cool breeze in August. Billy, the brashest of them all, took to calling her the ghost bride. From the confines of the house, Elise was also watching and listening. She was learning the geography of her new life. She learned the sound of Caleb's boots on the porch, a heavy, weary tread that told her the day was done. She learned the way the wind sounded when it came down from the north, a high, lonely keen that promised cold. And through the thin walls of the house, she began to explore the life that had existed here before her. One afternoon, with the sky outside a bruised purple and a slow, steady rain turning the yard to mud, she found herself drawn to the attic. The air upstairs was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and disuse. Sunlight struggled through a single grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. In a far corner, beneath a canvas sheet, sat a large cedar chest. She lifted the lid, and the smell of smoke, faint but sharp, rose to meet her. Inside, nestled in yellowed linens, were the relics of a life cut short. There was a woman's dress made of a fine blue calico. A large portion of it was gone, and the edges of the remaining fabric were blackened and brittle, the cheerful pattern dissolving into a grim, charred ruin. Beneath it lay a book of poetry, its leather cover warped and scorched at the corners. She opened it carefully. A woman's name was written on the flyleaf in a delicate, looping script. Sarah Ward. Elise traced the letters with her finger. At the very bottom of the chest, she found it. A silver locket, tarnished and blackened by heat. The clasp was fused shut. She held it in the palm of her hand. Its weight small but immense. This was Sarah. This was the woman her husband had loved. The woman who had died in fire. Holding the locket. Elise felt a profound and chilling kinship with the ghost who haunted this house. She, too, knew the terror of flames. She closed the lid gently, a coldness seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the rain. She left the attic, taking the silence and the smoke of the past down with her. A few days later, Caleb was working with his hands near the corral, tightening a loose post. The sun was hot, and the air was thick with the smell of horse and leather. Gus and Billy were repairing a section of fence nearby, and their voices carried on the still air. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong with her," Billy said, his voice loud and confident. "No woman covers her face like that unless she's got the devil's own mark on her." "Mind your tongue, Billy," Gus muttered, though there was a note of curiosity in his own voice. "It ain't our business." "It is when we have to look at it," Billy shot back with a laugh. "Or not look at it, as the case may be. I reckon Ward likes it that way. First a wife who burns, now a ghost bride who just haunts the kitchen. Maybe he prefers his women quiet." Something inside Caleb snapped. The casual cruelty of the words. The laughter that followed. The use of that word, ghost, it was like a lit match tossed into a powder keg. He dropped his tools, the clang of metal against wood sharp and violent. He strode over to the two men, his face a thunderous mask, his eyes the color of ice. "Get your things," he said, his voice dangerously low. He was looking at Billy, but the command was absolute. Billy's smirk faltered. What'd I do?" "You're done here," Caleb said, each word a chip of stone. "Get your pay from Jebediah and get off my land. Now." "But—" "It was just a joke," Billy stammered, the color draining from his face as he looked into Caleb's unforgiving eyes. "I'm not laughing," Caleb said. He stood there, a silent, immovable mountain of fury, until Billy scrambled to gather his things, casting fearful glances over his shoulder. Gus stood frozen, his hammer dangling from his hand, his eyes wide. Caleb turned his glare on him. "You got something to say?" Gus shook his head quickly. "No, sir, not a thing." Caleb turned and walked away without another word, the anger churning in him like a physical sickness. He was angry at the boy for his stupidity, angry at the world for its cruelty. But most of all, he was angry at himself, because in defending her, he had also defended his own haunted silence. The joke had hit its mark, wounding him in a place he kept hidden from everyone, even himself. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was heavier than ever. Caleb was still simmering in the dregs of his anger. Elise could feel it, a palpable heat radiating from him. She moved around the kitchen, her own thoughts troubled by the sudden departure of the young ranch hand. She knew, somehow, that it had to do with her. She was chopping potatoes for the next day's stew, her movements quick and methodical. Lost in thought, her focus slipped. The knife, wickedly sharp, slid off the curve of a potato and sliced deep into the side of her left hand. The pain was instant and fierce. She gasped, dropping the knife with a clatter. Blood, shockingly red, welled up and began to drip onto the clean wooden floorboards. "What is it?" Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He saw the blood, the crimson drops spattering the white potatoes. Before she could protest, before she could even think, he took her hand. His own was rough and calloused, engulfing hers completely, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. It was the first time he had touched her bare skin. The shock of it jolted through her, a current of heat and connection that was both terrifying and profound. She trembled, not just from the pain, but from the sudden, unexpected intimacy of his touch. "It's deep," he said, his voice gruff but laced with a concern that stripped away the anger from his face. He led her to the sink and pumped cool water over the cut, washing away the blood to inspect the damage. Her fingers were trembling in his grasp. He could feel the fine, delicate bones beneath the skin, the surprising softness. For a man who dealt in the rough and brutal realities of ranching, the feel of her hand was a foreign country. He kept his eyes on the wound as he reached for a clean dish towel. "Hold still," he commanded softly. He wrapped the cloth tightly around her hand, applying pressure. She stood beside him, so close he could feel the warmth of her body, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. He was intensely aware of her veiled face, turned toward him, and for a fleeting, insane moment, he wanted to reach up and pull the fabric away, to see the woman who trembled in his arms. He let go of her hand as if it had burned him and stepped back, putting distance between them once more. "Keep pressure on it," he ordered, his voice returning to its usual flat tone. He turned and retrieved a small tin of salve and a roll of clean bandages from a cupboard. He worked in silence, his movements efficient and sure as he cleaned and dressed the wound. His fingers brushed against hers, and each time, a small jolt passed between them. When he was finished, her hand was neatly bandaged. The bleeding stopped. "Thank you," she whispered, cradling her injured hand. He just grunted in response, already retreating back behind his wall of silence. But something had been irrevocably broken. A barrier had been breached. The simple, physical act of care had created a crack in the ice that had frozen the space between them. Later, as they sat over bowls of stew, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty, but filled with the echo of that shared moment. Caleb found himself looking at her, at the gray veil, with a new and unsettling curiosity. Who was this woman? This quiet, graceful, and perpetually hidden person he was now bound to? He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Your family," he began, the question feeling clumsy on his tongue. "You have people back east?" She stiffened almost imperceptibly. "No, I have no one." "And your husband," he pressed, driven by a need he did not understand. "What happened to him?" She was silent for a long moment. He watched her bandaged hand, where it rested on the table. She was twisting a loose thread on the tablecloth with her other hand, her focus intense. When she finally looked up, her face still hidden, her voice was perfectly level, but he could hear the faintest tremor beneath the calm. "It was a fever," she said. "In Kansas. It came on fast. There was nothing the doctor could do." It was a lie. The truth was fire and screaming, the weight of a heavy iron poker in her hand, the look of shock and rage on a man's face as he fell. The truth was the smell of lamp oil and her own burning flesh, a desperate, frantic escape in the dead of night. The truth was that she had fled an abusive monster she believed she had killed in self-defense, a man who had promised to love her and had instead tried to burn her alive. She kept that truth locked away in the deepest, darkest part of her soul, a monster she feared would one day break free and devour her. The lie was her shield, as solid and necessary as the veil that covered her face. Caleb heard the words, but he also heard the silence around them. He was a man who lived with the lies, the ones the town told about him, and the ones he told himself. He could recognize the shape of one, even when it was well told. He sensed the deep and terrible chasm between what she said and what was real, but he did not press. He had no right to demand her truth when he was so determined to keep his own buried. He simply nodded, and they finished the rest of their meal in a new kind of silence, one layered with secrets and unspoken questions. The storm hit 3 nights later. It came without warning, a black wall of cloud that swallowed the moon and stars. The wind rose from a whisper to a roar, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof. Caleb was woken by the sound of a shutter tearing loose and slamming against the side of the house. He dressed quickly and lit a lantern. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard, turning the deluge into a silvery, chaotic scene. He was pulling on his boots when her door opened. She was fully dressed, the veil in place. "The cattle," she said, her voice calm despite the fury of the storm. "The new calves in the north barn." The north barn was old, its roof prone to leaks. The new calves were vulnerable to the cold and damp. He nodded, grabbing a heavy oilskin coat from a peg. "Stay here. It's no place for you." "I can help," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. She took another coat from the wall, a spare one of his that swallowed her slender frame. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. He knew he would need the help. They stepped out onto the porch and were immediately assaulted by the wind and rain. It was a struggle just to make it to the barn, their heads bowed against the onslaught. Inside, the roar of the storm was slightly muffled, but the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the lantern cast long, dancing shadows. Water was pouring through a section of the roof, creating a small lake in the middle of the barn. Several of the calves were huddled together, shivering in the spreading puddle. They worked side by side in a frantic, unspoken rhythm. He mucked out the wet hay, and she spread fresh, dry straw. He herded the frightened calves to the drier side of the barn, and she soothed them with a low, gentle voice. They moved through the dark, their clothes soaked, their hair plastered to their skin. The storm was a wild and violent thing, but in its heart, they found a strange and focused peace, a unity of purpose that stripped away everything but the task at hand. In the brilliant, fleeting flashes of lightning, their eyes would meet across the length of the barn. In those moments, he saw her not as a mystery, not as a veiled stranger, but as a partner, a strong and capable woman working alongside him against the fury of the elements. He saw the strength in her jaw, the determination in her posture. She saw the worry etched on his face, the fierce protectiveness in his eyes as he checked on each and every animal. For the first time, they were not Caleb Ward and his mail-order bride. They were just two people fighting a common battle, their shared solitude a temporary, forgotten thing. They worked through the night, and when the first pale light of dawn crept through the barn door, the storm had passed. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, and the wind had died down to a sigh. They stood in the quiet aftermath, exhausted, mud-spattered, and soaked to the bone. The calves were safe, bedded down in dry straw. He looked at her. Her veil was a wreck, damp and torn near the hem. Clinging to the side of her face, a strand of dark, wet hair had escaped and was plastered to her temple. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, to thank her, to acknowledge the night they had just passed together, to ask if she was all right. The words were there, right on the tip of his tongue, but the habit of silence was a powerful, stubborn thing. The moment stretched, and then it broke. He turned away, his jaw tight. "I'll check the fences," he mumbled, and walked out into the clean, washed morning. He found her an hour later, standing by the porch, staring at the sunrise. The clouds were breaking, and shafts of golden light were spearing through, painting the wet land in brilliant colors. She had not changed her clothes, and her veil was still torn and damp. She stood perfectly still, a statue of gray against the vibrant morning sky. He watched her for a long time, an unfamiliar ache in his chest. She was a mystery, a paradox of strength and vulnerability. He almost spoke her name, but he could not. He turned and went about his chores. The tension between them for the rest of the day was a heavy, palpable thing. It was in every shared glance, every brush of hands as they passed in the narrow hallway. The cold politeness had been washed away by the storm, and in its place was something raw and charged, a current of unsaid words and unexpressed feelings. That night, she went to her room, but she did not sleep. The events of the past few days played over in her mind. The burned locket, his sudden, violent defense of her, the feel of his hands on hers, the shared fight against the storm. She was tired of hiding, tired of the weight of the veil and the secrets it protected. Slowly, deliberately, she sat on the edge of her bed and her hands went to the pins. She began to undo it. In the next room, Caleb was also awake, staring into the darkness. A floorboard in her room creaked under her weight, a small sound he would not have noticed a week ago. But now, he was attuned to every sign of her presence. A nameless fear, a premonition, made him rise. He walked to her door, which was slightly ajar. He saw her silhouette in the faint moonlight from her window, her hands at her head, the veil beginning to come loose. He did not know what drove him, fear of what he would see, or fear of what he would feel. He only knew he was not ready. "Don't take it off," he whispered, his voice a hoarse plea from the shadows. Her hands stopped. She hesitated, her body frozen in the act of revelation. The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of their separate pasts and the terrifying possibility of a future. Then, with a slow, resigned sigh that he felt more than heard, her hands dropped back to her lap. She obeyed. Again. Spring came to the valley not as a gentle guest, but as a fierce, muddy conqueror. The snow retreated grudgingly up the slopes of the mountains, leaving the pastures a sodden, tender green. Creeks, choked with ice for months, broke free and ran loud and brown. The air, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, carried the scent of damp earth and the promise of warmth. But while the land was awakening to a season of new life, the cold peace within the Ward Ranch house and the colder judgment in the town of Redemption Gulch remained stubbornly frozen. The change in Elise was as subtle and steady as the greening of the hills. She seemed to draw strength from the returning sun, shedding the last of her traveler's weariness. She moved with a purpose that extended beyond the four walls of the house. The ranch's animals, who judged by instinct rather than rumor, were the first to accept her. The half-wild barn cats would wind around her ankles. The horses, skittish around most, would lower their heads to her outstretched hand. She spent an entire night in the stables with a mare struggling to deliver a foal, murmuring to the animal in a low, soothing tone until, just before dawn, a healthy colt lay steaming in the fresh straw. The men, Jebediah and Gus, saw these things. They saw her quiet competence, her tireless work ethic. They saw how she mended their torn shirts, leaving them neatly folded on the bunkhouse porch. They tasted her cooking, which was simple but hearty, a welcome change from their own burnt fare. Respect, a slow-growing and hardy plant in the rocky soil of men's hearts, began to take root. They stopped speculating about the veil and started tipping their hats when she passed. Jebediah, a man of few words, summed it up one afternoon as he watched her calm a spooked horse. "She's got a good hand," he said to Gus, and that, from him, was the highest praise. But the town was another matter. The townsfolk's cruelty, fed by a long winter of gossip, had hardened into a kind of sport. She was Caleb's veiled wife, his gray ghost, a living symbol of his own dark past. They saw her silence as arrogance, her veil as a confession of some hidden sin. On their infrequent trips into Redemption Gulch for supplies, Elise would sit straight-backed on the wagon seat, her veiled face forward, a study in resolute composure as the whispers followed them down the street. "There they are," Martha Henderson would say from the porch of the general store, her voice a piercing whisper meant to carry. "The man who burned his wife and the one who won't show her face. A matched pair, I'd say." Caleb's hands would tighten on the reins, the leather creaking in protest. He had begun to defend her, his words like stones thrown into a swamp. One afternoon, a group of loafers outside the saloon had laughed as Elise stepped down from the wagon. "Hey, Ward," one of them called out. What's she hiding under there? A face that'd curdle milk? Caleb had turned on him, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. She is my wife, he'd said, his voice low and dangerous. Show her the respect that affords, or I'll teach you some. The man had shrunk back, but another voice from the crowd, emboldened by numbers, had called out, You're a fine one to talk about respect. Ward, we all know what happened to your first wife. The word struck Caleb like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and the strength from his convictions. He was poison. His own reputation tainted everything he tried to protect. He could not defend her from their words because their words were always, in the end, about him. After that, he said nothing more, simply shielding her with his body as they entered the store. His silent fury a more potent warning than any threat. It was on one such trip in late May that the past finally reached out for her. The general store was crowded, a rare occurrence. A handful of drifters and prospectors were passing through, stocking up on supplies. The air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, leather, and unwashed bodies. Caleb was at the counter, negotiating a price for seed grain with Mr. Henderson. Elise stood near the back, by the bolts of fabric, her gloved hand resting on a roll of simple cotton. That'll be 4 bits a yard, ma'am. Mr. Henderson said loudly from the front of the store, looking in her direction. Elise's voice, when she replied, was quiet but clear. That's fair. I'll take 3 yards, please. At the sound of her voice, a man who had been hunched over a sack of beans near the door suddenly went still. He was a scrawny, weather-beaten man with a shifty gaze and a coat that was more holes than cloth. He slowly straightened up, his head cocked as if listening to a distant sound. He turned and peered at Elise, his eyes narrowing at her veiled form. He took a few steps closer. I know that voice, he said, his own voice raspy. He moved with a shuffling gait, his eyes fixed on her. Said that name was Dubois, but that ain't the name I remember. Elise froze. It was not a visible, dramatic movement, but a sudden, deathly stillness that seemed to suck all the air from around her. Caleb felt it before he saw it. A change in the room's atmosphere, a new and terrible tension. He turned from the counter and saw the drifter closing in on his wife. Abigail, the man said, a grubby smile spreading across his face as certainty dawned. Abigail Miller, from down near Lawrence. I'd know that voice anywhere. Used to hear it when Miller sent me to fetch his whiskey. Beneath the veil, Elise's world tilted on its axis. The name, a name she had buried, a name that belonged to a different life, a different woman, echoed in the crowded store. She felt a cold dread wash over her. So potent it was a miracle her legs did not give out. Caleb saw the terror in her posture, in the way her gloved hand clenched the fabric so tightly her knuckles showed white. He moved instantly, placing himself between Elise and the drifter. He was a full head taller than the other man, his shadow falling over him like a judgment. The lady is my wife, Caleb said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with menace. And she has no business with you. The drifter blinked, his greasy smile faltering under Caleb's glacial stare. No offense, mister. I just thought I recognized. You were mistaken. Caleb cut him off. Now, back away. The man held Caleb's gaze for a second, then seemed to shrink. He saw the cold promise of violence in the rancher's eyes and thought better of it. He shuffled backward, muttering under his breath, and disappeared out the door. The store was silent, the other customers avidly watching the drama. Caleb paid for his goods, his movements stiff and angry, took Elise by the elbow, and guided her out of the store and into the blinding sunlight. The ride home was a torment of silence. The question hung between them, huge and unspoken. Caleb did not ask it. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He could still feel the terror that had poured off of her, a palpable wave of fear. It was the fear of a hunted animal, and it disturbed him more than he could admit. That night, the house felt smaller, the walls closing in on them after a supper that neither of them touched. He finally broke the silence. He stood by the hearth, his back to the empty fireplace, while she sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. "Who is Abigail Miller?" he asked, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier anger, leaving only a raw and weary curiosity. She did not answer for a long time. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly, each second a hammer blow against the silence. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, a sound of utter exhaustion, of a soul that had been pursued for too long. "I have been punished enough for the truth." It was not the answer he expected. It was not a denial, nor an explanation. It was a plea, a statement of profound and final weariness. He looked at her, at the gray veil that was as much a part of her as her own skin, and he saw not a liar, but a woman pushed to the very edge of her endurance. The anger he had felt was replaced by a grim, anxious foreboding. He wanted to press her, to demand the truth he felt he was owed. But he looked at her slumped shoulders, at the sheer weight of the secrets she carried, and he could not do it. He had his own ghosts. Who was he to demand she face hers for his benefit? He gave a slow, tired nod. "All right," he said, and the conversation was over. But it was not over for him. He did not press her further, but a new anxiety took hold of him. He began watching the road. Every dust cloud on the horizon, every lone rider, became a potential threat. He started carrying his rifle with him when he checked the fences, and he found himself sleeping lighter, his ears straining for the sound of approaching horses in the night. He feared someone would come looking for her. He feared what they would want when they found her. Their fragile routine re-established itself, but with a new, underlying current. An awareness had grown between them, a sense of shared vulnerability. They began to work together more often, falling into an easy, unspoken partnership. One evening, they were mending a fence at the edge of the property as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery colors. They worked in comfortable silence, handing tools back and forth, their movements synchronized. As he passed her a pair of wire cutters, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, skin against skin, but it lingered in the cool evening air. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. Her veiled face was turned toward the setting sun. "You don't have to hide from me, Elise," he said, the words coming out softer than he'd intended. It was an offering, a clumsy attempt to bridge the chasm between them. She turned her head, and though he could not see her face, he felt the force of her gaze. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a smile he could hear in her voice. "You are the one who is hiding, Caleb." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She saw him, behind his silence, his anger, his guilt. She saw the truth of him, a man hiding from his own life. The realization was both shocking and, in a strange way, liberating. He had no reply. He simply picked up his hammer and went back to work, the echo of her words resounding in his soul. A week later, he returned from town late. The whispers had been particularly bad that day. A child had pointed at him and said to his mother, "That's the bad man who burns things." The raw, innocent cruelty of it had driven him into the saloon. He drank more whiskey than he should have, seeking a numbness that never came, and he rode home under a star-filled sky, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. She was waiting up for him. A single lamp was lit, casting a warm glow in the main room. She said nothing about his late return or the smell of whiskey on his breath. She simply poured him a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair opposite him. He drank the coffee, the hot liquid doing little to warm him. He stared into the empty hearth, seeing not stone and ash, but fire and smoke. Her quiet, steady presence seemed to draw the poison out of him, the confession he had held back for 5 years. The words he had never spoken to another living soul began to spill out of him, his voice low and broken. "It was going to be a boy," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the past. We were going to name him Daniel. Sarah. She had sewn him a little blanket. Blue, with yellow stars. He choked on the words, a dry sob catching in his throat. There was a storm that night, a dry lightning strike. The sheriff figured I was in the lower pasture, trying to get the herd into the canyon before the worst of it hit. By the time I saw the smoke, it was too late. The barn, it was already an inferno. He fell silent, the memories overwhelming him. Elise sat perfectly still, listening, her veiled presence a vessel for his pain. She was in the house, he continued, his voice cracking. She was safe, but the blanket, the one she made for Daniel, she had left it in the tack room. She must have thought she had time. She ran inside to save a blanket. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. I got back and she was gone. I saw the flames in the barn window. I heard her scream my name. Tears he had refused to shed for 5 years now tracked down his weathered cheeks. I tried to get to her. God, I tried, but the smoke was so thick. The heat, it was like a wall. It drove me back. I could hear her. I could hear her screaming for me. And I couldn't reach her. I couldn't get to them. He buried his face in his rough hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. I let my wife and my son burn to death because I was not strong enough to get through a wall of fire. The room was filled with the sound of his quiet, ragged sobs. After a long moment, he felt a gentle touch on his hand. He looked up. Elise had leaned forward and taken his hand in hers. Her grip was firm, steady. She held his calloused, trembling hand, and she did not pull away. "Caleb?" she said softly. It was the first time she had ever said his name with such simple, unadorned tenderness. It was not a question, or a statement, but an acknowledgement, an acceptance. It said, "I see you. I hear you. You are not alone." The sound of his name in her mouth, spoken without fear, was an absolution he had never dreamed of receiving. Later that night, an unspoken understanding passed between them. He followed her to the door of her room and stood there, watching her in the moonlight that streamed through her window. The house was quiet, the ghosts of the past finally at peace. She turned to face him, and her hands, no longer trembling, rose to the pins that held her veil. She began to unfasten it, her movements slow and deliberate. He watched, his heart pounding in his chest. He did not speak. He did not plead. He did not stop her. The gray fabric slid away. For the first time, he saw her face. She was beautiful, even more than he had imagined, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and large, luminous green eyes that were now swimming with tears. And across her left cheek, stretching from her temple down to her neck, were the scars. They were old, healed to a faint, silvery sheen, the unmistakable, puckered tracks of a burn. His eyes widened, not in disgust, not in horror, but in a profound, soul-shattering grief. He saw not a flaw, but a map of a pain that mirrored his own. This was the secret she had been hiding. This was the source of her fear. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before he gently, reverently, touched the scars on her cheek. The skin was smooth, delicate. She flinched slightly at his touch, then leaned into it, a single tear escaping and rolling down her face. He looked into her eyes, and all the fear, all the distance, all the ghosts between them, dissolved in that one shared look of understanding. "You think that is why I could not love you?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, her own tears now falling freely. "No," she whispered back, her voice breaking. "It is why I came here." The revelation of the scars and the shared, broken confessions of that night changed the air in the house. The silence that had once been a wall of ice between them melted away, leaving in its place a quiet, shimmering space filled with a new and fragile intimacy. It was a tenderness that grew slowly, hesitantly, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through a hard frost. It was almost painful in its novelty. Mornings began not with a silent meal, but with a shared look across the table, his eyes tracing the faint, silvery lines on her cheek as if they were the most natural features in the world. He would wake sometimes in the gray pre-dawn light and find himself watching her sleep, her face soft and unguarded, and a feeling so fierce and protective would rise in his chest. It felt like an ache. She, in turn, began to see the man beneath the haunted rancher. She saw the gentleness in his rough hands when he handled a newborn calf, and the deep, weary kindness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. There were small moments of laughter, unexpected and startlingly loud in the quiet house. A clumsy sheepdog tripping over its own feet, Caleb, uncharacteristically, missing a nail and hitting his thumb with a hammer, cursing a blue streak that made her laugh until tears streamed down her face, a sight that made him stop his nursing of his thumb and just stare at her, mesmerized. The sound of her laughter was a miracle, a sound he had never expected to hear. Nights were the most profound. They would sit by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, and he would take her hand. His thumb would trace the scars on her neck and cheek, not with pity, but with a kind of reverence, as if he were reading a map of all she had survived. He was learning her history through his fingertips, and in his silent, steady touch, she felt a sense of safety she had never known. The gray veil, the barrier that had defined her existence for so long, now lay folded on top of the dresser in her room. It was a ghost of a life she was leaving behind, a skin she had shed. On the ranch, among the men and the animals, she no longer wore it. Her face, with its history of pain and survival, was open to the sun and the wind. She had not yet found the courage to face the town without it, but here, in this small pocket of the world, she was no longer hiding. But the world is a large and hungry place, and peace in the Wyoming wilderness is a fleeting thing. It was a stranger who brought the past galloping back into their lives. He rode into Redemption Gulch on a tall, raw-boned horse, a man who looked as if he had been carved from the dust and rock of the trail. He was not a cowboy or a prospector. He wore 2 holstered pistols, their handles worn smooth, and his eyes were cold and patient, the eyes of a hunter. His name was Elias Kane, and he was a bounty hunter. He did not go to the saloon. He went straight to the small shack that served as the sheriff's office. The town watched, buzzing with speculation. An hour later, Kane emerged and pinned a notice to the board outside. It did not take long for the news to spread like a prairie fire. The notice, issued from the state of Kansas, offered a $500 reward for information leading to the capture of a woman named Abigail Miller. She was wanted for the murder of her husband, Marcus Miller, a respected landowner. The whispers began immediately. A woman from Kansas, a murderer. It was Martha Henderson who first gave voice to the town's suspicion, her words sharp and certain. "It is her," she declared to the small crowd gathered around the notice. "I will wager my soul on it. The veiled bride, hiding from sin." Just as I said. The idea took hold, fueled by months of suspicion and dislike. It made a dark, satisfying kind of sense to them. The woman who hid her face was, of course, a killer on the run. Caleb was in the blacksmith shop, waiting for a new set of horseshoes, when Sheriff Brody found him. Brody was a decent man, but a weary one. A man who preferred a quiet life and was often swayed by the loudest voices in his town. He looked uncomfortable, his face etched with a mixture of duty and apology. "Caleb," he said, his voice low, "I need a word with you." He led Caleb outside, away from the prying ears of the blacksmith, and showed him the notice. Caleb read the words, and a cold dread washed over him, turning his blood to ice. Abigail Miller, the name the drifter had spoken. Wanted for the murder of her husband, his heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He looked from the paper to the sheriff's worried face. "The town is talking. Caleb," Brody said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "They are saying this is your wife. You know she is a mystery. People are scared." "They are fools," Caleb snarled, his voice a low growl. But there was no conviction in it. He handed the notice back, his hand trembling slightly. He turned without another word, strode to his horse, and swung into the saddle. He rode out of town at a gallop, the dust rising in a frantic cloud behind him, his mind racing. The world had found her. The past he had feared was no longer a distant rider on the horizon. It was here, and it carried a warrant and a rope. He found her in the small garden she had started behind the house, tending to a row of fragile new bean sprouts. She looked up as he approached, a smile gracing her lips as she saw him. The smile vanished when she saw the look on his face. "Caleb, what is it?" she asked, rising to her feet, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. He could not soften the blow. There was no time. "There is a bounty hunter in town," he said, his voice strained. "He is looking for a woman from Kansas, a woman named Abigail Miller. He has a warrant for her arrest, for murder." She did not gasp. She did not cry out. A profound stillness came over her, the same deathly quiet he had seen in the general store. The color drained from her face, leaving her scars standing out in stark relief against her pale skin. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her green eyes filled with a terrible, weary resignation. The fight seemed to go out of her, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion of a hunted animal that has finally been cornered. "Come inside," he said gently, taking her arm. Inside the quiet of the kitchen, she finally told him everything. She stood by the window, looking out at the mountains, her back to him, as the whole ugly, painful story came pouring out of her. "His name was Marcus," she began, her voice a monotone, as if she were reciting a story about someone else. "My father arranged the marriage. He was a wealthy man, a respected man. Everyone thought I was the luckiest woman in the county." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "He was charming when he wanted to be, but the charm was a mask. Underneath, he was cruel. He liked to cause pain. He told me it was his right, that a wife was property, to do with as he pleased." Caleb stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, a helpless rage building in him as he listened. "The beating started a month after we were married," she continued, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He would apologize the next day, bring me gifts. He would promise it would never happen again, and for a week or a month, he would be the perfect husband, and then it would happen again. I learned to see it coming, a darkness in his eyes. I tried to leave once. He found me, dragged me back. He told me that the only way I would ever leave his house was in a pine box." She finally turned to face him, and he could see the memory of the terror in her eyes. The night of the fire, he had been drinking heavily. He was angry about something, a business deal that had gone wrong. He took it out on me, but this time was different. There was a madness in him I had never seen before. He threw a lamp against the wall. The oil spread. The flames, they went up so fast. She took a ragged breath. "He laughed. He stood there, between me and the door, and he laughed as the room filled with smoke. He said he was going to purify me with fire. I grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace. He came at me, and I swung it. I just swung it. He fell. There was so much blood. I do not know if he was dead. I just knew I had to get out. The fire was everywhere. I remember the heat, the pain on my skin. And then I was outside, running into the night. I ran until I could not run anymore. I heard later that the house burned to the ground. They must have found his body in the ashes. They must have thought I set the fire to cover it up." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I did not want to kill him. Caleb, I just wanted to live." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. He could feel her trembling, the shudders of a trauma relived. He held her head against his chest, his hand stroking her hair. "It was self-defense," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "Any decent man would see that." "The law is not always decent," she replied, her voice muffled against his shirt. "And it is his word, the word of a rich, respected man, against a woman who ran—" He held her at arm's length, his hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Then we run, too," he said, his voice urgent. "We will pack what we can. We will leave before dawn. We can head north, to Montana, or even Canada. We can find a place where no one knows us, where this cannot find you." He saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a deep and unyielding resolve. She gently removed his hands from her shoulders and stepped back. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have been running for almost a year. Caleb, every shadow, every strange face, every knock on the door has been a terror. I have lived in fear every single day. I am tired of running." "Elise, they will hang you," he said desperately. "Then they will hang me," she replied, lifting her chin. "But I will not spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I will not let the ghost of Marcus Miller chase me to my grave. I will stand here. This is my home now. I will not be chased out of it." That night, sleep was an impossibility for both of them. For Elise, the confession had unlocked the cage where she kept her worst memories. She fell into a fitful, shallow sleep and dreamed of fire. She was back in that room, the heat scorching her skin, the acrid smell of burning oil filling her lungs. She could hear Marcus laughing, a demonic roar that echoed in the crackle of the flames. She could feel the weight of the poker in her hand, could see the look of surprise on his face as he fell. She woke with a strangled cry, her body drenched in a cold sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Instantly, Caleb was there. He had been sitting in a chair in the corner of her room, watching over her. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms, holding her as the violent tremors racked her body. "You are safe," he murmured over and over, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her terror. "I am here. You are safe." He held her until the shaking subsided, until her ragged breaths evened out, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window. He did not let her go until morning. The bounty hunter arrived the next day. He rode up to the ranch house just before noon, his presence a dark omen against the bright spring day. Caleb met him on the porch. "Mr. Ward," Kane said, his voice smooth and professional. He remained on his horse, looking down at Caleb. "My name is Elias Kane. I am a duly appointed agent of the law. I am tracking a fugitive from Kansas, a woman named Abigail Miller. I have reason to believe she may have passed through this area. Your wife, she arrived here under unusual circumstances. I hear—" Caleb leaned against a porch post, forcing a look of bored indifference onto his face. "My wife's name is Elise, and she is gone." Kane's cold eyes narrowed slightly. "Gone?" "Left about 2 weeks ago," Caleb said with a shrug, his heart hammering in his chest. "Did not work out. She was not suited to this life. I took her to the stagecoach myself. Said she was heading back east, Boston. I think she said—" The lies came easily, fueled by desperation. Kane was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the ranch house, the barn, the quiet yard. He was searching for any sign of a lie, any crack in the story. "I see," he said finally. "Would you mind if I spoke to your hands?" "Be my guest," Caleb said, gesturing toward the bunkhouse. From the kitchen window, hidden behind a curtain, Elise watched the exchange. She saw Kane ride over to the bunkhouse. She saw Jebediah and Gus stop their work and speak to him, shaking their heads. After a few minutes, Kane tipped his hat to them, turned his horse, and rode away without a backward glance at the house. When she was sure he was gone, She walked out onto the porch. Caleb was still standing there, staring at the empty road. His shoulders slumped with the release of a tension so great it was a physical weight. "He is gone," she said quietly. Caleb turned to her, his face grim. "For now." She looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and guilt. "You should not have to lie for me." "Caleb." He stepped toward her, his eyes intense, fierce. He took her face in his hands, his rough palms gentle against her cheeks. "Elise," he said, his voice low and hoarse with emotion. "I would lie to the world if it meant you stayed free." The raw, unconditional power of his words stripped the breath from her lungs. In that moment, she understood the depth of his love for her. It was not a gentle, poetic love. It was a fierce, protective, and absolute thing, a shield he would hold up against the entire world. That evening, as the sun began its descent, they stood together on the porch, watching the sky burn a brilliant, bloody red. The beauty of it was violent, a reflection of the turmoil in their hearts. The bounty hunter was gone, but they both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Fear and the threat of loss hung heavy in the air around them, a tangible presence. He turned to her, and in the fiery light of the sunset, he drew her into his arms. He kissed her, and it was not a kiss of gentle affection, but one of desperate, profound need. It was a kiss that spoke of fear and grief, of a love that had been forged in fire and silence. It was an affirmation of life, a defiant cry against the darkness that was closing in on them. He led her inside, to his room, as the last of the light faded from the sky. There, in the gathering dark, they came together. It was a joining that was both tender and heartbreakingly sad, a desperate act of claiming and being claimed. Every touch was freighted with the weight of their pasts and the uncertainty of their future. It was a silent, solemn vow, a promise to belong to each other, even if only for this one stolen night. Later, as they lay tangled together in the quiet aftermath, the moonlight painted a silver stripe across the floor. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her, his fingers gently tracing the lines of her face. His gaze fell to the simple silk ribbon she always wore tied around her neck, a ribbon that hid the deepest and most severe of her scars. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, and he whispered the words that had once been a plea born of fear, but were now a murmur of love and acceptance. "Don't take it off." She looked up at him, and, in the dim light, he saw a soft, gentle smile touch her lips. She raised her hands to the back of her neck and undid it anyway. The quiet intimacy that had settled over the ranch was a fragile, stolen peace, and it lasted only 4 days. On the 5th day, Elias Kane rode back into Redemption Gulch. This time, he was not just asking questions. This time, he came with proof. It was a wanted poster, printed on cheap, flimsy paper, the ink already fading in the harsh Wyoming sun. The drawing was a crude artist's rendering, the lines harsh and unskilled, but it had captured something of her. It had the height right, and the set of the shoulders, and the eyes, even in the clumsy sketch, held a familiar look of haunted resilience. Below the drawing were the words, stark and damning. $500 reward for Abigail Miller, wanted in the murder of her husband. Kane pinned the poster to the board outside the sheriff's office, and it acted like a lit match on dry tinder. The town's simmering hatred, its long-held suspicion of the outsider, ignited into a self-righteous blaze. The poster was not just a piece of paper. It was a validation. It was proof that their cruelty had been justified all along. They were not gossips. They were discerning judges of character. They had known she was hiding a great sin, and here was the evidence, nailed up for all the world to see. Sheriff Brody, caught between his own quiet doubts and the growing clamor of the town, found his hand forced, with the bounty hunter presenting a legal warrant and the townspeople demanding action. He could no longer delay. He saddled his horse, his movements heavy with a reluctance he could not show. He deputized 2 men from the general store and with Cain riding grimly beside him, set off for the Ward Ranch. Caleb saw them coming from a mile away, a slow-moving cloud of dust on the horizon. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, what it meant. He had been watching the road every day, and his vigilance had not been born of paranoia, but of premonition. He met Elise in the main room, his rifle already in his hand. "They are coming," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Brody, Cain, and 2 others." Elise looked at the rifle in his hand, then at his face, which was a mask of grim determination. She simply nodded, her own face pale but composed. The moment she had been running from for a year had finally arrived. Caleb stepped out onto the porch as the riders approached, his stance wide, the rifle held loosely but ready at his side. He did not raise it, but its presence was a clear and unambiguous statement. He was the line they would have to cross. The 4 men reined in their horses a dozen yards from the house. A few of the more curious and bloodthirsty townsfolk, having followed the posse from town, lingered at a distance, their faces eager with anticipation. "Caleb," Sheriff Brody began, his voice strained, "do not make this difficult. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Abigail Miller, also known as your wife, Elise Ward." "Her name is Elise Ward," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble, "and this is her home. You are not welcome here, and you are not taking her." "That is not your choice to make," Cain interjected, his voice as cold and sharp as a winter wind. He unbuttoned the flap of his holster. "She is a wanted fugitive. Step aside, Ward, or you will be charged with obstructing justice." "I do not care what you charge me with," Caleb replied, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "You are not setting foot on this porch." The standoff stretched, thick and heavy in the afternoon sun. The distant crowd began to murmur, their voices growing louder, uglier. "Bring the murderess out," a man shouted. "Justice for her husband," another cried. The shouts were a chorus of hate, a verdict already delivered. Just as Sheriff Brody was about to dismount, the front door of the house opened. Elise stepped out onto the porch. She had put the gray veil back on, a piece of armor for the battle to come. She moved to stand beside Caleb, placing a calming hand on his arm, on the tense muscle that held the rifle. She looked out at the angry, expectant faces, at the armed men on horseback, at the hate that had followed her across half a continent. Then she looked at Caleb, at his desperate, defiant face, at the love that was about to make him spill blood for her sake. And she made a choice. "It is all right, Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the tense silence. She turned to face Sheriff Brody. "I will not let blood be spilled for my sake. There has been enough violence in my life. I will go with you." "Elise, no," Caleb said, his voice a strangled plea. "It is my decision," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She squeezed his arm. "Put down the gun, please." He looked from her shrouded face to the men before him, his gaze full of a tormented, helpless fury. For a long, agonizing moment, he did not move. Then, with a shudder that ran through his entire body, he slowly, reluctantly, lowered the rifle. The standoff was over. The ride into town was a gauntlet of humiliation. Elise sat on her own horse, her back straight, her veiled head held high, a queen being led to her execution. Caleb rode beside her, his face a thunderous mask of rage, his hands gripping the reins so tightly they were numb. The crowd followed them, their numbers swelling as they got closer to town. The whispers and murmurs had turned into open jeers and taunts. "Kill her," someone shouted. "Look at her, hiding her evil face," another cried. A woman, it was Martha Henderson, stepped forward and spat on the ground near Elise's horse. Then a stone flew from the crowd, a sharp, ugly projectile that struck Elise squarely in the shoulder. She flinched, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. But she did not cry out. Caleb spurred his horse forward with a roar, turning on the crowd. But Sheriff Brody's men quickly boxed him in, preventing him from retaliating. He was forced to watch, to listen, to endure, as the town he had grown up in vented its collective poison on the woman he loved. They put her in the town's only jail cell, a small, dark room at the back of the sheriff's office with a single barred window and a cot. It smelled of damp stone and despair. The heavy iron door clanged shut behind her, the sound of finality echoing in the small space. But Elise did not break. When Sheriff Brody came to her cell an hour later, accompanied by Kane and a few of the town's more prominent citizens, he found her sitting calmly on the cot, her veil neatly folded in her lap. Her scarred, beautiful face was composed, her green eyes clear and direct. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady, "I would like to tell you my story. Not the one on that poster, but the truth." For the next hour, in the cramped and silent jailhouse, she spoke. She told them everything. She spoke of Marcus Miller, of his charm and his cruelty, of the beatings and the isolation. She spoke with a quiet, unadorned dignity that lent her words an unshakable power. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply stated the facts of her life, the facts of her abuse, with a clarity that was more damning than any emotional outburst could have been. She described the final night, the fire, the terror, the fight for her life. "I did not kill a husband," she concluded, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the men before her. "I survived an executioner. I ran because I knew the law. A law made by men like him would not believe me. I ask you now, look at my face. Look at these scars. Are these the marks of a murderer, or are they the marks of a woman who was sentenced to burn?" The room was utterly silent. The men, who had come in full of righteous certainty, now stood shifting uncomfortably on their feet. They looked at her scarred face. They heard the truth in her voice, and for the first time, seeds of doubt began to sprout in the hard soil of their prejudice. Even Elias Kane, the bounty hunter, seemed to lose some of his cold certainty, his gaze on her thoughtful and unreadable. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, unable to meet her eyes. "The circuit judge will be here in a week," he said gruffly. "He will hear your testimony. Until then, you will remain here." Caleb visited her every day. He would sit on a stool outside her cell, and they would talk through the bars. He was a man possessed, consumed by a frantic need to save her. "I have sent a telegram to a lawyer in Cheyenne," he told her on the second day. "The best one they have, and another to a man I know in Kansas, a private investigator. I have asked him to find people who knew Miller, people who might have known what he was like, who can speak to his character." He reached through the bars and took her hand. "I will not let them do this to you. Elise, I will prove you acted in self-defense. I promise you." She would listen, her heart aching for his desperation, for the love that drove him. She had found more kindness in this haunted man in a few short months than she had known in her entire life. But while Caleb was fighting for her with law books and telegrams, a darker force was gathering in the town. There were men in Redemption Gulch who held old grudges against Caleb Ward, the Hart brothers, a family of rival ranchers who had a long-running dispute with Caleb over water rights, were chief among them. They saw Elise's arrest not as a matter of justice, but as an opportunity. It was a way to strike at Ward, to humiliate him, to break him. In the smoky back room of the saloon, fueled by cheap whiskey and old hatred, a plan was hatched. They did not care if the woman was innocent or guilty. They cared only that she belonged to Caleb Ward. They would not wait for the circuit judge. They would see to justice themselves, the frontier justice of a rope and a mob. On the third night of Elise's imprisonment, a figure on horseback rode into town. He was a well-dressed man, clearly from the east, looking starkly out of place in the dusty Wyoming street. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and walked in. It was Thomas Ward, Caleb's brother. Caleb's desperate telegram, A plea for funds for a lawyer had brought him on the first available train. He found Caleb sitting vigil on the bench outside the jail. Caleb looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair, and saw his estranged brother standing before him. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, the years of silence and resentment falling away, replaced by the simple, urgent reality of the crisis before them. Thomas did not offer platitudes or recriminations. He simply sat down next to his brother. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. That night, the mob came. They gathered at the saloon, their numbers swelling to nearly 20 men, their courage fortified by liquor. The Hart brothers led them, their face flushed with drink and malice. They carried torches that threw flickering, demonic shadows on the walls of the buildings, and one of them carried a coiled rope. They moved down the street, a dark, murmuring river of hate. Their destination, the small jailhouse. Caleb and Thomas were inside, talking with Sheriff Brody. When they heard the noise, they looked out the window and saw the sea of angry faces, illuminated by the bobbing torches. "Dear God," Brody whispered, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Bar the door," Caleb said, his voice grim. From her cell, Elise heard the shouting. She scrambled to the small, barred window and peered out. She saw them, the angry mob, the torches, the rope. The sight sent a spear of pure terror through her. The fire, the smell of smoke, the shouts of angry men. History was repeating itself, a nightmare come to life. The flames of the torches reflected in her wide, terrified eyes. The mob surged toward the small building. "Bring her out, Brody!" one of the Hart brothers bellowed. "Or we will come in and get her." They threw themselves against the door, the wood groaning in protest. Caleb and Thomas braced it with a heavy desk. The sheriff, pale but resolute, stood with his shotgun aimed at the door. "This is a house of law," he shouted, his voice trembling. "Disperse now, or you will be met with force." His only answer was a rock shattering the front window. The mob roared its approval. They began to use a heavy wooden beam as a battering ram, the rhythmic thuds shaking the entire building. "We cannot hold them," Thomas said, his face grim. "We have to," Caleb replied through gritted teeth. The door splintered, then burst inward. The mob poured in, a chaotic, drunken wave of violence. The small office exploded into a brawl. It was not a fight of skill or honor. It was a desperate, bloody struggle for survival. Caleb and Thomas stood back to back, fighting with a savage fury. Fists flew, men cursed and fell. A lamp was knocked over, but miraculously did not catch fire. Elise could only watch the horrifying silhouettes through her bars, the violent dance of shadows cast by the torches outside. She saw Caleb fighting, a wild and desperate figure in the chaos. She screamed his name, her voice a raw, ragged sound of terror, but it was lost in the din of the brawl. The fight spilled out into the street. Caleb, swinging a broken chair leg, fought to keep the men away from the back of the building, away from her cell. One of the Hart brothers came at him with a club. Caleb blocked the first blow, but the second caught him hard on the shoulder, sending a searing pain down his arm. He staggered back, and another man hit him from the side, a glancing blow to his head that made the world spin. Just as the mob seemed about to overwhelm them, Sheriff Brody finally acted. He fired his shotgun into the air. The blast, deafeningly loud, echoed through the street. He fired again. The sound of the gunshots, more than anything else, seemed to break the mob's fever. Men hesitated, their drunken courage failing them. They looked at the bloody faces of their friends, at the grim determination of the Ward brothers and the sheriff, and the fight went out of them. They began to back away, melting back into the darkness from which they had come. The street fell silent, littered with the groaning bodies of the injured. Thomas stood, breathing heavily, a cut bleeding freely over his eye, and Caleb, his strength finally giving out, collapsed to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder. the world dissolving into a dizzying spiral of pain and darkness. The world returned to Caleb in fragments of pain and light. He was in his own bed, the familiar scent of the cedarwood bed frame filling his senses. A sharp, grinding ache was anchored deep in his left shoulder, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. He opened his eyes and saw her, a silhouette against the bright square of the window. Elise. She was sitting in a chair beside the bed, her hands busy with some mending, her face, unveiled and clear in the morning light, turned toward him. "You are awake," she said softly, putting aside her sewing. She moved to the bedside and placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. Her touch was infinitely gentle. "What happened?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "You were hurt," she said simply. "Thomas is with the sheriff. It is over. Caleb, the mob is gone." His brother, Thomas, had stayed for a week, a quiet, steady presence that bridged the years of resentment between them. He helped Elise tend to Caleb's wounds, his eastern softness giving way to a surprising practicality. He spoke with Sheriff Brody, providing a clear-headed account of the night's events and making quiet inquiries about legal matters, his city ways proving unexpectedly useful. He saw the way his brother looked at Elise, the fierce, protective love that had nearly gotten him killed, and he finally understood the life Caleb had chosen, the man he had become. Before he left to catch the train back to Philadelphia, he stood by Caleb's bed. "You were right to come out here," he'd said, a simple admission that healed a wound far older than the one in Caleb's shoulder. "You found something true." The circuit judge arrived in Redemption Gulch 2 days after the brawl. He was a stern, no-nonsense man who had seen too much of the frontier's rough justice to be swayed by gossip. He listened to Sheriff Brody's account of the lynch mob, his expression growing darker with every word. He then had Elise brought before him in the sheriff's office. She told her story again, her voice unwavering, her gaze direct. The judge listened, then read the report from the law in Kansas, a document filled with the assumptions of men who had been friends with her husband. At the end of it all, he slammed his gavel down on the sheriff's desk. "This is not a case of murder," he declared, his voice booming in the small room. "It is a clear and tragic case of a woman defending her own life from a brutal husband. The warrant from Kansas is invalid in my jurisdiction. This woman has suffered enough. She is free to go." And so she came home. Sheriff Brody himself drove her back to the ranch, an act of public apology and a clear message to the town. She walked back into the house not as a prisoner, but as its mistress. And she took up her vigil by Caleb's side. She changed his bandages, spoon-fed him broth when he was too weak to lift his arm, and read to him in the long, quiet afternoons from the scorched book of poetry she had found in the attic. In the quiet crucible of his recovery, their love, born in desperation and fear, was tempered into something strong and enduring. He was helpless, and in his vulnerability, he finally allowed himself to be cared for, to be loved without reservation. She, in turn, found a new and profound strength in being his protector, his comfort, his peace. The town of Redemption Gulch remained a house divided against itself. The failed lynching had left a scar on the community's soul. The Hart brothers and their cronies, nursing their injuries and their pride, were sullen and resentful. They muttered in the saloon that the judge was a fool and that Ward's money had bought his wife's freedom. To them, Elise would always be the murderess who had gotten away. Their hatred was a poison that seeped into the town's groundwater, and half the town drank deeply from it. But there was another half. Her story, told with such quiet dignity, had resonated with many, especially the women. They were women who knew the private sorrows of a hard life, who understood that what happened behind a closed door was often far from what was presented to the world. They had seen the ugly face of mob rule and were shamed by it. They did not welcome Elise with open arms, but their hostility was replaced by a grudging, watchful respect. The whispers did not cease entirely, but their tone began to change. As Caleb's strength returned, a new tension grew between them. The legal threat was gone, but the social one remained. A constant, low-grade fever One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, Elise finally gave voice to the idea that had been forming in her mind. "We could leave, Caleb," she said, her voice soft. "We could sell this place. Thomas said he would help. We could go west, to Oregon or the Washington Territory. Somewhere new, somewhere the land has no memory and the people do not know our names." It was a vision of peace, of a life free from the ghosts of Wyoming and Kansas. He was silent for a long time, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains against the star-dusted sky. This land was in his blood. This ranch, the only home he had ever truly known. But it was also a place of immense pain, a landscape of ghosts. He looked at Elise, at her hopeful, anxious face, and he saw the strength that had inspired him to face his own demons. "You told me once you were tired of running," he said quietly. "I reckon I am too. I have been running from that fire, from Sarah's memory, from what these townsfolk think of me. For 5 years, this is my home, Elise, and now it is your home. I will not be chased out of it. We will not be chased out of it." His words were a quiet declaration of war, not a war of fists and guns, but a war of endurance. It was a choice to stand their ground, to claim their right to happiness not in some distant, imagined paradise, but here, on the ashes of their own past. She saw the resolve in his eyes, a calm strength she had never seen before, and she knew he was right. They would not run. They would stay. They would heal. The following week, they rode into town together. Caleb's arm was still in a sling, but he sat tall in the saddle. Elise rode beside him, and for this final confrontation, she wore the gray veil. It was not a shield of fear anymore, but a symbol, a final piece of her old life that she had to shed in the open. They tied their horses in front of the general store and stood on the boardwalk. As always, their arrival caused a stir. People stopped what they were doing. Faces appeared in windows. A crowd began to gather, a mixture of the hostile and the curious. Martha Henderson stood on the porch of the store, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stern judgment. One of the Hart brothers leaned against a post outside the saloon, a smirk on his lips. The street fell into a tense, expectant silence. Caleb stood beside Elise, a silent, solid pillar of support, ready to defend her. But this was not his fight to win. It was hers. Slowly, deliberately, Elise raised her hands and untied the ribbons of the veil. She pulled it from her head, letting the gray fabric fall from her fingers to the dusty boardwalk. She stood before them, her head held high, her scarred and beautiful face open to the judgment of the world. She let them stare. She let them see the map of her survival, the proof of the fire she had walked through. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried with an astonishing clarity in the silent street. "This is my face," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting every eye, flinching from none. "I have been burned, and I have lived. Can you say the same?" Her words were a challenge, a judgment thrown back at them. She was not asking for their pity or their forgiveness. She was demanding their respect, confronting them with a courage that shamed their petty hatred. The smirk vanished from the Hart brothers' face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Martha Henderson's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The crowd was utterly, profoundly silent. They had come expecting a spectacle, a monster to revile. They were met instead with a queen, regal in her scars, who refused to be broken. Then, a small movement, a woman at the edge of the crowd, the blacksmith's wife, a woman known for her quiet demeanor, gave a short, sharp nod of respect. Another woman, standing near the church, did the same. It was not a flood of acceptance, but it was a beginning. It was a crack in the town's wall of prejudice, a testament to the power of a single, courageous soul. Elise held their gazes for a moment longer, then turned, took Caleb's good arm, and they walked into the general store, leaving the silent, chastened town behind them. Months passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The land, ever resilient, healed itself. The pastures, which had been trampled and torn by the events of the spring, grew thick and green again. And on the ranch, a deep and abiding peace settled over the two souls who called it home. Their love was no longer fragile or hesitant. It was a quiet, steady thing, as reliable as the sunrise, as strong as the mountains that framed their valley. When his shoulder was fully healed, Caleb began to build. He went to the blackened skeletal ruins of the old barn, the monument to his guilt that had stood for 5 long years, and he tore it down. Piece by piece, he cleared away the charred timbers, exorcising the ghosts with the sweat of his own labor. And on the ashes of the old foundation, he began to build a new barn. It was an act of hope, a statement of faith in the future. Elise worked beside him, hauling lumber and fetching nails, and in the rich, dark earth beside the new foundation, she planted wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and wild roses, a riot of defiant color against the memory of the ash. The final scene of their story unfolded on an evening in late September. The new barn was finished, its fresh pine boards glowing gold in the light of the setting sun. They stood together on the porch, leaning against the rail, looking out at the vast, peaceful expanse of their land. The wind, which had once seemed so lonely, now whispered a gentle song through the eaves of the house. He reached out and touched the faint, silvery scar on her cheek. His touch was as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. "I am not afraid anymore," he whispered, his voice full of a quiet wonder. He was not afraid of the fire, of the ghosts, of the judgment of others, or of the love that had saved him. She turned and smiled at him, a soft, radiant smile that reached the depths of her green eyes. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a perfect and final surrender to the peace they had fought so hard to find. "Neither am I," she replied. Their love, a seed planted in the barren soil of guilt and fear, had survived the fire, the silence, and the judgment of the world, and had grown into something stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined, a testament to the enduring power of two scarred souls finding their home in each other. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. Please comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel, and be sure to share your thoughts in English.